In 2015, or just prior to that, JM received word from Joshua it was time to start another pilgrimage to Israel. The other 6 pilgrimages had been between 2003 and 2008. There were 5 in that period. And then one in 2011, which was the biggie, in which I believe a portal was opened at the upper room, creating the incursion point, the initial incursion point between the joining of heaven and earth. This was something that I just knew in my bones, even though I've been profoundly skeptical about so many things. This one I just knew for sure in myself. I didn't need external confirmation. Now, the idea of external confirmation was an interesting one. And as I returned to Israel in 2015, the trip was going to be to Israel and then to France, to Mary Magdalene's, the area where Mary Magdalene lived in France. So we went to Israel in 2015. I was essentially just looking for confirmation. Had anything changed at the upper room? And the second issue was there was this ongoing thing of the believer centers, the holy sites, all having increased interest, more people coming, since there'd been a resetting of the frequencies of the holy sites by the group in 2007, I think it was. And every year we'd come back, 2007, 2006. So every year we'd come back in 2007, 2008, 2011. There'd been a gradual increase every year in the number of people at the believer sites, the holy sites. So I was curious to see if that was also increasing. But mostly I wanted to return to the upper room to see if there'd been any change, anything physical that might suggest that what happened in 2011 was actually a real thing. So we get to Israel. So it's really a trip of confirmations, potentially, more than anything. We get to Israel, and sure enough, all the I call them believer centers, it's really holy sites. All of the holy sites, again, have this uptick in activity. And things are really getting busy now. It's changed a lot. The city's teeming with activity and prosperity where everybody had been struggling 10 years prior. So finally we get to the upper room. Now the upper room had been, it's downstairs. It's St. Mark's church in, it's right in the middle, right off the David steps in the old city of Jerusalem. We're quite sure that what's the official designated space for the upper room, which is above the tomb of David, is not the actual physical place. We just know that the house of Mark was the upper room. And it's actually, as the nun who has been there all the time we've been there, and this magnificent woman, magnificent servant of Christ, Justina, she would say it's the upper room down, because the way the city built up, what used to be the upstairs is now the downstairs, yeah? So we'd been there many times, and every time it's kind of like a downstairs basement space, stone walls, dimly lit, but a very profound kind of womb-like transformational cocooning space. And every time I'd been there, something major had happened to me in my transformation. So we go back to the upper room. There'd been no physical change in the upper room in the 10 years that we'd been going to it. So we get to the upper room, and one other thing, the portal opening, as I understand it, occurs as I and another person are sitting in the courtyard, not in the church and not downstairs in the upper room, but in the courtyard, because we're there late at night and the church was closed. Courtyard right before you walk into the church. So go into the church, and found one thing out right away, was that they had found a whole new house underneath where the upper room was, and they'd never found that before in all the thousands of years, you know. So that was an interesting indication that something had changed. But going into the upper room was fascinating, because it go down the way the stairs had changed. And I get downstairs, the entire room has been rebuilt. The walls are all new, and they have this beautiful onyx stone sort of look. The ceiling's new. It's all lit with these bright LED lights. There's a new altar. I mean, it's a completely transformed space. This is profoundly confirming for me that something's happened. And also, as we come in, walking down the steps, and J.M. had said this is the exact spot he'd put his hand when he first went there. So all of this journeying starts in 2003, in February, when a guy named James Twyman, who you might know, invites J.M. to go to Israel on a trip he's hosting. JM goes to the upper room. In this, he tells the story beautifully of this amazing synchronistic event where he's guided to go to the upper room by Justina, who met him coincidentally at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he goes down and he puts his hand on the wall. The JM is said by Jeshua to have been John Zebedee, the disciple John. Puts his hand on the wall, and this is really JM's story to tell, but I'll just tell it briefly. And when he puts his hand on the wall, he flashes back and immediately is in the upper room right after the crucifixion, in the chaos and fear and everything that all the disciples are going through. I mean, he's literally there, like not just imagining it. He's there. He has that capacity. So, and he mentioned when we went back, and there had been at that spot a square dug, carved into the wall. This is in the basement space. And then it had been tunneled out, I don't know, 6 feet maybe. So there was this open space, a square, open channel kind of, and then it went up from there to the courtyard, where there had been put a clear glass, piece of glass or plexi or whatever, so that light could come in. It would be a light shaft bringing light into the upper room. And there were 2 of those, and there were the 2 of us sitting there when the portal was open. So, like in terms of physical changes, I pretty much couldn't imagine anything more specifically confirming the experiences I'd had. The same was true going to the Tomb of David, where I had been at the end of the 2011 pilgrimage. I went to this place which felt like this almost dimly lit European Jewish ghetto street almost, like quiet, dark, where the Holocaust Memorial was. Very solemn and almost like another dimension walking into it. And I'd been guided to go to the David tomb at the end of the 2011 trip and had this experience there. And now on this street they'd put LED lights in the street and these new green trees, and I almost couldn't believe it was the same space. It was like everything was being lit from within. Jerusalem had all new signs, the old city, posting places where to go. All the signs had been replaced. The sign at the David tomb had been replaced. Everything looked new. Everything looked new and changed in this brightly lit place. And even the David tomb itself, which I had gone into, and there was this kind of dark cavernous space that I'd spent some time in, it was now brightly lit with these LED lights. It felt almost like it was daytime, even at 2 a.m. And the tomb itself, where everyone was praying, was incredibly brightly lit. So this is an interesting time. We start getting into another story that's never been something that I really wanted to go to, but it becomes a big part of what happens after this. And yes, we're going to start talking about galactic friends. Yeah? I'd always been grateful in the Way of Mastery. There'd been no discussion about ETs or about, Arcturus and Sirius and all this stuff that they talk about. There was one mention at the very end of the Way of Mastery. It says the lineage comes from off of this world, ultimately. But that could be taken metaphorically, like, a spiritual being could be seen as off of this world. If Jeshua says something, I feel compelled to essentially believe it until it's proven otherwise, because he's been so right about everything else. And I just believe him. So I've been so grateful that the past life stuff had been a big challenge, but I've been really grateful there'd never been anything about ETs. But Eliyahu McLean, the rabbi we work with, had taken a group of us to a section of the Western Wall, the sacred Western Wall, which was now open to men and women for the first time. It had only been open for a couple months, and we were able to go there, and there's almost no one else there. And so while I was there, I had the opportunity, I went back with a couple friends later, it was just the 3 of us there. I had the opportunity to lay down and put my crown chakra up against the wall. I was guided to do this. And I had this kind of explosion, and I felt my mind just go off, way off into the distance, like a loop. Way off into, when I say the distance, I mean into space. And kind of loop out and loop back. And for the first time, and we'd become familiar with this idea of portals, But for the first time, and I have to say this completely freaked me out, actually. For the first time, I sensed, oh, there's something else on the other end. There are beings on the other end of this. This is not a one-way transmission. Later, a friend of mine and I went to the David tomb, the very end of the trip, kind of a bookending to my experience in 2011. And I saw, and when I was in the David tomb, I had the same experience again of this expansive cosmic awareness. And it hit me so hard, he had to almost carry me back to the hotel. I felt like I was been hit by a big truck. So these are all pieces of what happens in Israel in 2015. The confirmation of the portal opening, and now a new, in a sense, deeper sense of this idea. And what the ramifications of it are, it's not a one-way street. I know people talk about this so much, but I had no personal experience with ETs, and therefore found it a very uncomfortable subject, and one I had no business talking about. But I was starting to have what could be called a personal experience of it. So this is the next step in this. We're in France. We're having lunch, and it's a big cafeteria full of, 80, 90 people, because it's not just our group. And chatter. And I feel just to go sit by myself for a little bit, just thinking about things, a little bit away from the crowd. And a friend of mine comes over, and he says, Dave, I've just been told this by somebody in the group. It was a woman who I really trusted and hadn't said much, so I was really interested in what she might be saying. And she said that you have this history, we have this history, of having been ambassadors for Jeshua to other planets. To like ambassadors in the world, like from one country to another, well, from one planet to another. And I thought, oh no, and this was a guy who I couldn't just dismiss as being frivolous, because he's quite central to the Way of Mastery stuff. And been right about a lot of other things. And I'm like, oh no, now we got to deal with the ET thing. Oh, I was so happy that was never part of it. And I try to ignore them. And then I look up, and JM, who has never talked about ET stuff that I'm aware of, JM pops up. He's on the other side of the room, a long way away. There's no way he could have heard what we were talking about. No way. He couldn't have heard if I was at the end of the table he was at. It was so loud. So he just pops up, stands up, boop, like a prairie dog, and in a good way, and walks over right to where we're at. And the people we're sitting with says, "Oh, don't talk about the ET stuff, because JM doesn't really want to talk about that." So everybody's quiet when JM gets to the table, and he starts telling a story. Just starts, and he talks about this story, but when he was in Santa Fe, and I hope I get it exactly right, he was in Santa Fe channeling the Way of Mastery and working with Jeshua, and Jeshua was teaching him to leave his body at night. So he leaves his body, can look down and see his body in the bed, and then he's in an adobe house in Santa Fe, leaves the house, goes through the adobe wall. He says he can see the thickness of the adobe as he's going through, then kind of floats around Santa Fe, looks down, and then comes back to his body. I'm like, that's cool, all that. That's pretty amazing. I don't know how to do that, but I think it's cool, and I think it's possible, too. He says, it's the first time he's ever talked about this subject, right after the other people had come to tell me about this. He says, yeah, so one day, Jeshua has me leave my body, and I notice myself go through the adobe walls. I'm in the backyard of the house, and there's a spaceship there. And Jeshua's in the spaceship talking with, I believe he said two beings. And Jeshua says, come here. I want to introduce you. And then the story goes on from there. But so for the first time, after the experience I'd had in Israel, and then these people coming over and talking about this, for the first time, JM spontaneously, miraculously, coincidentally, none of that, right? He's listening to Jeshua. It's the perfect time now for me to start being introduced to the idea of that we're not alone in this. There's a galactic piece to the entire atonement plan. It's not just the atonement for the earth, it's the atonement for everything. And Jeshua was a cosmic being. I've known that, right along. And so if he's a cosmic being, then what are we? It's starting the training of starting to see ourselves as cosmic beings as well. That's a big part of what happens in 2015 on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and then to France. That revelation begins in France. So 2015 Israel pilgrimage. Thank you for listening.